I'm Inez Stepman, in for Rachel Bovard.
I'm Josh Hammer.
I'm Emily Jashinsky.
And I'm Ben Weingarten.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Unfortunately, of course, today we're going to kick it off talking about the tragic and evil events in Texas, the school shooting. We're going to move on to talking about an inter-GOP battle over the issue of biological sex and protecting girls and women in sports. And then we're going to move to something that I think is on everybody's at least pocketbook, if not their minds, Biden's energy policies and gas prices coming up to a record high. And then we'll be moving finally to foreign policy, talking about sort of the language around standing with Taiwan while functionally funding the Chinese Communist Party. So Josh, do you want to kick it off with our first unfortunate topic?
Yeah, so it's unfortunate that we have to do this. It's tragic, obviously, that we have to do this, but I think it would be deeply imprudent and unwise of us to escape the elephant in the room, as terrible as that elephant is, which of course is the mass shooting in Uvalde, Texas, coming pretty close on the heels of the recent mass shooting in Buffalo, New York. What happened in Uvalde, of course, comes roughly 10 years after the similar elementary school mass shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown, Connecticut. Look, this is unfortunately, the left, as always, pivots to gun control in a situation like this. I guess from my perspective, my first immediate takeaway is, and I say this, by the way, as someone who comes from a long line of teachers. My mom is actually an elementary school teacher. She's a third grade teacher. She's retiring next month after 20 plus years of just admirable and heroic service. I'm so very proud of her. My grandmother was a special education teacher. My great grandmother was actually a special education teacher. So this kind of hits home, to be honest with you, quite a bit. I guess from my perspective, the first thing that comes to immediate mind is 10 years after Sandy Hook, after Newtown. How the hell is there not armed security at every single school in America? I mean, it is just mind-boggling to me that, it seems like everywhere you look, when the left is not trying to defund the police, make the police go away. I mean, there are officers who tend to be at all these kind of random locations, doing all sorts of things. I mean, if we are not prioritizing the security of our children, what, for the love of God, are we doing? So I guess the answer is that the left's hatred of guns extends to such an extent that they, I think, are incapable of kind of rationalizing to themselves the idea that there is such thing as a good man with a gun. I mean, it's become kind of this NRA talking point, but it's really not just a talking point. It happens to be true that evil exists in this world, and the way to combat evil is with good. And as the case may be in this case, the best way to combat that evil with good is with armed and trained good. And that can only come, obviously, by having school security. One other thing that I was really happy to see my friend Ann Coulter kind of get out in front of, this was her quick kind of column, is we can start talking about involuntary commitment again. The demographic is shockingly similar for all of these various mass shootings, not always. So the Las Vegas shooting, of course, where the shooter was at the Mandalay Bay Hotel in late 2017 or 2018, whenever that was. That was an older man, but usually, almost always, it seems, it is a younger, troubled, late teen, early 20s kind of loner, profoundly loser young man. And these people have to be kind of mentally ill. There was clearly something, to state the obvious point, there was something profoundly wrong with the kind of human being who does this. And to the extent that our overly liberalized asylum and mental laws do not allow for someone of this nature to be kind of taken away to a mental asylum, certainly in kind of the late 1960s, when a lot of kind of Warren Court criminal procedure was being liberalized in America in general, our institution and our civil commitment laws were drastically liberalized. I think if there is one kind of thing that conservatives should really start talking about besides the armed security point, from my perspective, it is that obviously there's going to be a newfound push for all sorts of kind of incremental, quote unquote, gun control measures. I think conservatives properly will probably just reject most of these proposals. The reality is, even if you wanted to, quote unquote, control guns, and no one here on this podcast needs to hear this, obviously, there are more firearms than people in the United States of America. So even if you wanted to do that ship has simply sailed. We decided a very long time ago that we were going to have a well-armed citizenry. That obviously is why the Second Amendment is right there in the Bill of Rights, going back to 1791. That's not to say that we shouldn't theoretically be open to the idea of a compelling empirical thing. So for example, if something like a red flag law, actually, if it were compellingly demonstrated based on hard empirical data that this really, really worked, I think we should be open to it at least. But that simply does not exist. There is no such thing as kind of any proposal that I'm aware of that is shown to have any kind of empirical, compelling, reasonable way to kind of actually get through the problem, because we are ultimately kind of an increasingly kind of atheistic, kind of unchristian society, and that is just profoundly sad. But I guess on that note, I'll just kind of get y'all's thoughts on that little soapbox.
Yeah, to jump in here, I completely agree with you about the conversation about commitment. It's involuntary commitment, right? It's obviously a large part of the homelessness conversation. Actually, then Governor Reagan is the one who liberalized those laws in California. I think it's a small piece of the problem, of course, but it's at least as valid a conversation to have as the seemingly just endless conversation that goes around and around about guns and gun control. But I was thinking about some other things that we are never part of this national conversation. One is media infamy, which there actually is some pretty good social science and demonstrating that there is a connection, that these things happen in clusters because of the infamy granted to the first or second one of these guys who commits this kind of heinous act. Daily Wire was way ahead of everybody else in refusing to publish the names of these guys. We just dissected someone's national manifesto, which parts of it were left wing, which parts of it were right wing. I mean, that in itself does create an enormous incentive to go out and do these kinds of heinous, evil acts. Another thing we don't talk about, fatherlessness and broken families. 80+% of these guys are coming from homes where their biological father is not involved. And then finally, I think, Josh, you touched on it a little bit, but there is a post in the United States, a post-Christian, but in the West more broadly, post-religious crisis of meaning. It does seem to have more violent results in the United States than it does, say, in Europe. Maybe that's because we're still a more sort of youthful and vitalistic society, slow decline, not seemingly in the cards for us, more explosive and seems to be confronting us at this point. But these are all things that don't fall into what seem to be the two buckets, or I guess three buckets of these horrible incidents that we're allowed to discuss. One is if they're connected in some way with racism, right? Obviously, then that's the narrative, white nationalism. If that doesn't work, then it's the gun control narrative, even though in most of these cases, there's no evidence whatsoever that any of these gun laws would have stopped them. In this case, for example, the shooter already broke 2 gun laws in the process of getting into the building, one about concealed carry and one about carrying firearms on school campuses. So those are 2 gun laws that were ignored by this shooter and many others. And then the third bucket, of course, is just the memory hole, right? These mass killings, if they don't fit into either one of those narratives, then we just forget they exist, which is what happened with the subway killings in New York. So all of those national conversations, I guess I do sympathize with the exhaustion that people have with them at this point. They just seem so beside the point. We're not going to move. It doesn't seem likely that we're going to move on, sort of the issue of guns or anything else, or any of these major national conversation items. And they are taking the place of perhaps more meaningful conversations that we could have around, around insanity and involuntary commitment, around media, and around fatherlessness. These are conversations that we might actually be able to move forward in some way, but we're not having them because, there are the buckets, and we're going to stay the buckets of conversation that we have after every single one of these tragedies.
Media is the easiest conversation to have, in fact, because it's a clear the connection between media coverage and repeated mass shootings has been borne out by social science. Zed Jelani reposted an excellent write-up that he had done for Berkeley a few years ago in the wake of what happened yesterday. It's pretty obvious that the way we cover these things, and Inez talking about the manifesto is such a good example. These people love the mystique of being picked apart. And so the media has a huge responsibility, and there's zero interest. I understand it's tough, but there's zero interest in covering this better. And that is really that is really, I think, an easy route right there. I would hope that this does open up conversations about involuntary commitment laws, because it should also reopen a conversation about social media, frankly, because we now see the Buffalo shooter was on Discord. This person had from yesterday had posted menacing and threatening type social media. It's just, there has to be a better way. Over and over again, we see the same things happening. And while a gun is a commonality in all of them, there are many other commonalities in all of them. And so I know we're running low on time, and I'll kick it over to Ben.
Yeah, I guess I'd say briefly, and it goes without saying, but the shameful demagoguery of the president and his allies here is sickening once again. Before the bodies have turned cold, that there is a rush to essentially, first of all, try and violate the natural right to self-defense of millions of law-abiding American citizens on the basis of the acts of clearly insane and deranged people, fueled by a toxic kind of social media and media environment more broadly, which sort of makes this the story, and then in their own sick, twisted minds, it allows them to sort of glorify their acts and to become bigger than I guess they are, as the very small people that they all clearly are in their own lives. So, there's the shameful demagoguery aspect of it, which is sickening, and itself speaks to a sickness within our society, that there's the rush to try and destroy our political adversaries and run roughshod over our Second Amendment as a consequence of the acts of the most insane and deranged people. And then there's the other aspect of this, I think, which is that, as everyone has spoken to, what about the culpability of the individual, not the culpability of society here? And then what are we going to do to prevent this going forward? And the prevention should not be to disarm, again, the law abiding. It should be to protect individuals in these schools with those who honor the Second Amendment. And I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to say about this topic. We could do the whole show, obviously, and many more after that on what the deeper problems here are and why we do seem to have such a higher rate of particular kinds of violence. And that's not limited to gun violence, by the way, by any stretch of the imagination. We have higher knife crime than the UK. and they don't have the guns, they're replacing them with knives, so their knife crime is going up, but ours is still outpacing them. So there's obviously a huge conversation to be had, but let's turn to the second topic, which is about a war within the Republican Party over the biological definition of sex. Well, just to kick it off here, I mean, it's kind of a sad thing that we're having this inter-GOP war over this, to the extent that this is something that literally everyone, 99.999% of people, agreed upon in virtually every society in the history of man, that there are biological differences between men and women. But nevertheless, of course, there is no issue upon which establishment Republicans cannot sort of bow out of a fight over. So most recent episode of this is that Governor Eric Holcomb of Indiana actually vetoed a women's sports bill. This really basic thing that says that if you're going to play in a public school, if you're going to play sports, you have to be the biological sex that sports team is made for, not your identification. We're not going to assign you to sports based on your identification. Well, that veto was just overridden by the Republican legislature. But this is not the first Republican veto of this kind of bill. Last year, we had Louisiana's Governor Bell Edwards vetoing a similar kind of sports bill. Governor Asa Hutchinson vetoed a medical transition for minors, a law banning medical transition for minors. He got humiliated on Tucker Carlson over it. This year, he did sign a women's sports bill. But we had Utah Governor Cox. He's vetoed one of these women's sports bills. Famously, Kristi Noem last year vetoed one of these bills at the insistence of the NCAA, and then was able to sort of be convinced over by the groundswell of opinion against it, both in her state and nationally. And she signed one of those bills last year. But I think it's important to note that even on such a fundamentally obvious issue as the biological differences between the sexes, there is pushback from the establishment GOP. It's going to require a lot of effort, and not just from the right. And not to repeat myself, although I hear that the best thing is to repeat yourself early and often, but The culture war really is the big 10 here. This is an issue where we have 80+% of Americans on our side, and that includes a lot of not only moderates, but Democrats. We should be putting the left on the defensive here with policies like my institution, IWF, and IWV. We have something called the Women's Bill of Rights, which defines biological sex in the law. We should be actively seeking to define it because, as we talked about last week, there are attempts through the administrative state to redefine sex in a way that'll never go through the hands of the voters. So it's up to us now to make sure that we actually are passing on the state and the federal level good law that actually defines biological sex and prevents this kind of those kinds of redefinitions from the administrative state. And I'll kick it out to the rest of you.
It's a good example of what Terry Schilling talks about. And Inez, we've talked about this many times. There's maybe a misinterpretation of the Andrew Breitbart maxim that politics is downstream of culture. And Terry always pushes back and says, that's absolutely true, but you can't take for granted that the culture is also downstream of politics. And so the administrative state, if we think all the way back to 2016, the Dear Colleague letter from then Education Secretary John King, that he released under President Obama, which essentially read gender identity into Title IX for publicly funded schools. Camille Paglia at the time wondered if that was what it predicted, actually, that might be what loses the election for Hillary Clinton. And what we saw after that, I don't know how true that turned out to be, but what we saw, it's kind of hard to disentangle all the variables, but what we saw after that was this massive push in the culture to sort of use that. It gave credibility. That policy gave credibility to this idea. And then it was amazing how it soaked the administrative state in this definition and in this this effort to redefine the phrase. And so that's, I think, a really important I think it's really important to recognize the ripple effects of these administrative decisions, because once it comes, it's a domino effect that goes throughout the massive administrative state. And so fighting it on both levels, both on the cultural level and on the political level, is absolutely necessary in this case.
Yeah, I mean, so look, I think about oftentimes, probably more than I should, kind of the founding of the Republican Party back in the middle of the 19th century. Back in the 1850s, Abraham Lincoln was famously the first Republican president. I'm like a real Lincoln file. I'm like born his birthday, so I think about kind of those founding days a lot. The early Republican Party back in the 1850s was founded as this quite erudite essay from Robbie George and a co-author who I can't remember, back in National Review like 15, 20 years ago, noted the original GOP was founded to oppose what it called at the time the quote unquote twin relics of barbarism, which it was referring to at that time as slavery and polygamy. The latter, of course, took on at the time kind of like an anti-Mormon hue. The former, of course, I think is self-explanatory. But I if there is such thing as kind of a modern kind of analog as barbarism, I think it is gender mutilation and castration and really a lot of kind of the kind of egregious manifestations of modern gender ideology. And I think about the fact that if the Republican Party is, and the conservatives in general, are going to stand for literally anything, they're going to stand for literally anything, it surely has to be for the male-female biological dichotomy that is the literal core, the literal building block of the family, which by extension, of course, is the literal building block of civilization. So, holding aside, obviously, something that we point out on this podcast all the time, which is that as a pure kind of political self-interested matter, actually fighting the culture war with the aim of victory, is not necessarily something that redounds against Republicans' interests. To the contrary, if done prudently and effectively, it oftentimes can redound to their interests. CEG, Glenn Youngkin, obviously, in Virginia. CEG, of course, the polling that clearly supports everything that Florida is doing with respect to the, quote unquote, don't say gay bill with respect to Disney and so forth. So it just seems to me that this is such an obvious issue that the Republican Party must get right. And to the extent that there are kind of fifth column elements in our own ranks who would try to salvage our very clear assertion of the biological building blocks of humanity, those fifth column elements have to ultimately be kind of, undermined and ideally excised, I think.
Yeah, I mean, something like this, it's so blatantly obvious. If it's right on the merits and right on the politics, and as a Republican, you're not there and you are opposing, in effect, your constituents by going against your legislator, and clearly a significant percentage of them, given that the legislature ultimately overrode, what are you doing in the Republican Party? And it's noteworthy that in the governor's sort of rejection of the bill, he kind of cited 2 points, at least 2 points. And one of them was, first of all, that, the provisions of it could lead to some inconsistencies, essentially drafting issues with it. And then another was that, look, other states have brought up similar legislation and they've run into issues with the law, namely with, judges of all ranks probably potentially enjoining the legislation or otherwise halting it. Okay, but as a governor, shouldn't you be fighting to, if you don't like the language, modify the language? And shouldn't you be zealously defending it in a court of law to the extent it ends up there? If not, why not? I mean, very basic questions here. Thankfully, the legislature overrode in this case, but it's simply remarkable to see that a Republican governor wouldn't have the courage of his convictions on something like this, particularly, again, when the constituents are all there. And lastly, briefly, just on the politics versus culture, I think there's certainly a symbiotic relationship there, and we can debate it. Politics impacts culture, culture impacts politics, and political changes can sometimes have cultural impacts that persist over the decades, and that might not be immediately seen. But I think it's worth noting also that the Democrat sort of policy is to use any and every potential lever to advance their ideology, whether it is the administrative state, effectively an unelected branch of government who is executing its will, whether it is through woke capital and using both finances and progressive advocacy groups to agitate on behalf of their positions, whether it is their cultural influence, academic influence, and then by the law. And Republicans have to think in a holistic manner as well. And I think this represents just one manifestation of where the fight ought to be on behalf of the actual science.
I just have to, before we wrap up this segment, jump in on behalf of the late great Andrew Breitbart, as this is what Josh is laughing about over there in the corner, because we were recently in a symposium together, and I made the same point, and I will make it to Terry Schilling when I see him next time. And that is that we're misusing Breitbart's maxim. I know that there are people who would use that maxim about politics being downstream from culture to sort of head off the political solutions to cultural problems. That is not what Andrew Breitbart meant. He was trying to call attention in 2012 to the fact that the GOP only, the things that seem actually really obvious to us now and that we've all been talking about, he was really on the edge, the leading edge of. He was saying you can't just cut taxes and ignore the fact that the culture is falling off a cliff. So just to defend the late great Andrew Breitbart on that point, but nevertheless, it's a salient point. That phrase has become a stand-in for a particular type of conservatism that absolutely exists, that imagines that that cultural issues can only have cultural solutions and not capital P political ones. But let's transition to the next subject here, Emily. Let's talk about something that's hitting everybody in the pocketbook. Let's talk about the price of gas, inflation, and American energy policy.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are policies coming from the Democratic Party right now, the purported party of the working class, that are making the pain at the pump all that much worse. Gas prices continue to set records, and it is appropriate to have this conversation on this week, which finds a lot of Americans driving to celebrate Memorial Day, one of our most important holidays in this country. That's, of course, not merely about barbecues and fun, but about remembering the lives lost and the service of defending and protecting that freedom that we enjoy as we drive around to visit family and friends on Memorial Day. So the Biden administration's energy policies, I mean, starting with their idiocy with the Nord Stream 2 sanctions, but then going on down to refusal to unleash the full might of American energy and insisting that we're in, quote, a transition process towards renewables is remarkable. Maybe you can give Biden applause for actually saying the quiet part out loud, which is that this is a transition process. It's something that has snuck into the Democratic Party's rhetoric many times over the course of the last couple of decades, but is directly directly responsible for the pain people are feeling at the pump. Of course, there are effects from unavoidable circumstances overseas. There's no question about it. But in the immediate future, this pain could certainly be greatly alleviated were the Democratic Party to change its stance on unleashing the full power of American energy, as opposed to forcing Americans through a painful period of transition intentionally to incentivize a rush to renewable energy. So it was interesting to see Biden talk about the quote transition this week. It's interesting to consider what they will be doing as this continues in an election year. They tried the Putin price hike line out for a while, and I'm not sure that it landed, especially in the face of their own inability to unleash the full force of American energy policies. So it's incredible, and I wonder actually if the electoral pains that Democrats face as a result of the pain that everyone's feeling at the pump will finally be what induces a shift and some sanity. I don't know, because as much as they like to talk about special interests in the oil and gas industry, there's plenty of special interests in the green industry as well that has Democrats fully in their pocket. So I'll open it up to the group and just ask this question. What on earth is the Biden administration doing? And is there any possibility that we see a shift in energy policies because of the severity in an election year, with new records being set seemingly every week?
So I want to make a very quick addendum to the final segment. So just for the record, at the symposium that Inez and I were at, where she made this point about Andrew Breitbart, I certainly yielded. So that was score Inez 1, Josh 0 on the point at issue there. So I want to give credit where credit is due. But to the current conversation here, look, I mean, I refilled my car at the pump last week. I'll probably do so again very shortly, because my car has, for whatever reason, like a smaller tank than it should. And like these prices are just disgusting. I mean, it is completely astronomical here. But I guess the point that I want to make, similar to the last segment, is that this is yet another issue where the proper policy and the proper politics completely converge. I mean, the environmentalist nutjob lobby, the green zealots, the people that would are effectively kind of Malthusian radicals who think that you're killing the planet by giving birth to new life, by giving more kind of carbon dioxide emitting human beings. Those people are a tiny fraction of the electorate. But as with so many elements of the Democratic Party's ridiculous modern kind of intersectional identity politics, interest group driven, bizarre coalition of the oppressed and kind of the Upper West Side white liberals and whatnot, due to the nature of the disproportional kind of heft that they pull within that coalition, they kind of show their might in the blue check Twitterati and Twitter and whatnot, but they are a tiny fraction of the electorate. The most of the electorate here just wants gas prices to get under control. I mean, it is not a particularly radical solution. I mean, I saw a report, it was either from JP Morgan or Goldman Sachs or one of the bulge bracket banks just a couple of days ago, that said that prices from here are expected to only go further high. I mean, like I saw literally one estimate, 25 to 30% higher than the current baseline. We could potentially be looking at like $6 a gallon gas if this thing is not kind of rectified within the next few months. So this is just such an obvious thing for me. Again, similar to kind of the male-female biological dichotomy. This is just be such an obvious thing for Republicans as they kind of gear up for midterms this fall. Get America energy independent. It was one of the most under-discussed miraculous elements of the Trump presidency, was that America was no longer a net importer of fossil fuels by the end of the 4-year Trump presidency. It was an incredible, incredible achievement, and Republicans should be adopting this as a major talking point.
Josh, I really think you put your finger on something here, which is the difference between conservation and modern environmentalism, which is so stark. I mean, when I think about, for example, Teddy Roosevelt's conservation efforts, right? They're actually focused on conserving the natural world for the purpose of humanity, right? Teddy and others were concerned about what man would become when divorced wholly from nature. That is such a different concern than modern environmentalism, which seems to look on humanity itself as a cancer, and then think that the world will be better off without man. And I do think that that's like an important, both psychological and ideological distinction. But yeah, I mean, this conversation seems to be so utterly unserious. Like even taking the premises, right, for granted, right? Let's say that climate change is a concern. I'm not particularly concerned about it, but let's grant for the sake of argument that that's a concern. If one were to go about that concern in a actual serious way, of course, and this is not, I'm not the first person to make it, the nuclear power would be at the top of the list in terms of actual alternatives to fossil fuel that produce enough energy to make not just produce enough energy to power the grid, but to make the grid reliable, which is another huge issue that America is probably going to face going into the summer, where demands on energy are high, not just skyrocketing prices, but the grid itself being unreliable and shutting down. It seems like we're all going to live in California now, where there are rolling brownouts and blackouts. This is, third world stuff. And again, we're missing the sort of forest for the trees if we're actually going to go about moving towards a cleaner world in terms of the energy we burn. Of course, pre-industrial societies had dirtier methods of creating energy than coal. Natural gas is cleaner than coal. Nuclear power is cleaner than both of those. All of them have downsides, but it's sort of this. I do think it has to do with folks being so detached from the actual actual consequences of really, really high energy costs. They go beyond the pump. The pump is where people feel it the most in America, especially because we are such a car-driven culture. But the high cost of energy really does redound on the working class the worst, and it really does affect the prices of almost everything, right? The fact that it's more expensive to ship things, the fact that it's more expensive, to create all kinds of plastics and things that we need to make in order to produce the goods. I mean, this is the cost of energy is something that goes into nearly every aspect of the economy. And the fact that we are so like sort of head in the sky about it, and the left refuses to even sit down at a table, and even within the concerns about sort of environmental concerns, to have a serious and hard-headed conversation, but how we might actually fund the middle class lifestyle that Americans are used to, without producing too much pollution in various forms. We have no serious conversation about that right now, because the left does have this "humanity's a cancer and it'd be better if we don't even exist" attitude, which is kind of like Israel negotiating with certain aspects of with their neighbors. It's like you can't really negotiate when the position of the other team is you shouldn't exist.
I'm glad, Inez, that you hit the point about the fact that higher energy prices are baked into literally everything that makes modern life run. So it's not strictly a at the pump hardship. It's a hardship in virtually every aspect of our economy. And I also want to make the point that underscore Josh's point about the fact that we were energy independent. And if you're not energy independent, you were energy dependent. And who have we been dependent on for decades? Well, of course, the Middle East. Now you see with the Biden administration going hand in hand to a Venezuela or an Iran, which it intends to fill the coffers of after it executes an Iran nuclear deal 2.0. And of course, it empowers Middle Eastern regimes who play every side against the middle and basically align with the strong horse at the end of the day. But of course, oftentimes use their funds to fund proxies who seek the death of America. So, there's the energy independence aspect of this, which is about our independence as a country. And if we're not independent when it comes to that most vital input of energy, then we have major, major problems. Of course, there's the irony here that those on the left who suddenly became the greatest Russia hawks in the world post-Cold War are also the ones aligned with the environmentalists who served Putin's agenda by helping drive up the price of oil and forcing us to go elsewhere to get oil. Then there's, of course, the, let them eat Teslas kind of, or I guess not Teslas now because Elon Musk is no longer kosher for them, but whatever the electronic vehicle or alternative vehicle will be, aspect of it, which just shows you this sort of pie in the sky view of our betters. So in every single aspect of this, it's disastrous. And the last point I'll make is I remember, I'm old enough to remember when Hillary Clinton went to Virginia and talked about the fact that we're going to kill coal. And that was viewed as one of the great political gaffes of that era. This agenda is far more brazen, radical, destructive than that. And it ought to be called out as such. This is about punishing the American people in service of a political agenda that, of course, will line the pockets of the left and its allies, and will serve arguably an even broader nefarious agenda to punish Americans, towards whatever their ultimate ends are. I can't even begin to get into their mindset to understand why you would hurt the citizenry to such an extent as they do. But on that note, since I was talking about independence versus dependence, I'll transition to my topic, which was sort of spurred by what I believe CNN literally cast as the Biden strategy of strategic confusion with respect to Taiwan. Of course, every single time Joe Biden has gone off script, his handlers have tried to walk back his statements, particularly on massive issues like those of war and peace, and in this case, with regard to China. So Joe Biden basically said that America was committed to defending Taiwan. And he said this while speaking with his Japanese counterpart during this trip to the Indo-Pacific to try to lock in some sort of nascent trade pact, trade alliance with nations in the region. Of course, ultimately, one would have to think, even though they don't explicitly say this because they're soft, to counter China in the region and diversify our supply chains, harden them, etc. Now, it would appear that this was scripted based upon the nature of the way in which Joe Biden went about it. But of course, his handlers walked it back immediately and said, our position hasn't changed. We continue our strategic ambiguity. I wish I could believe that this was an attempt at strategic ambiguity and not a question of who actually is in charge today. But we have all of those questions to ask. We also have questions to ask about, okay, to the extent that America is devoted to defending Taiwan, that necessarily means we're willing to get into a war with communist China. What does that entail? What should the American people be willing to bear? What steps would the administration take to deter China in that instance? We haven't talked about any of those questions, really. The president hasn't, his administration has not. But then there's something that's fundamentally unserious about this. And there's one narrow point and one bigger point about this. One is that while Biden was negotiating this sort of new Indo-Pacific nascent alliance, Taiwan was excluded from it, despite the fact that he's talking about defending Taiwan. But number two, and this is a small point, but representative of a much bigger one, and this has not been covered widely by the press. Some will recall that during the Trump administration, the thrift savings plan, which is sort of the 401k retirement plan that members of the federal government can contribute into, was looking to change one of the funds, one of its international funds that members of the government, including servicemen and women, could invest in, which would have led to the financing of myriad Chinese companies, many of which are blacklisted, that fund or that represent and arm China's war machine, that provide the surveillance technology used in the Xinjiang gulags and beyond. So essentially, you could have had U.S. service members putting their retirement savings in companies working towards ultimately destroying our military. The Trump administration fought tooth and nail, along with some members of the Senate and the House, to push for the board that oversees these retirement accounts not to shift into this international fund that would expose our servicemen and women, government members, to basically financing and underwriting a regime aimed at their demise. The Biden administration is now looking at creating an opportunity for thousands of new mutual funds or other funds to be invested in with retirement accounts, which they have admitted, the board has admitted, they cannot vet to see whether Chinese companies will be included in these funds, including Chinese companies that are in many cases blacklisted, sanctioned, et cetera. So several members of the U.S. Senate have raised an uproar over this, including among them Senator Rubio, Scott, Hawley, Cotton, Marshall, and Portman. There are also several members of the House as well, who they have jointly written letters to the Federal Retirement Thrift Investment Board about this. But this speaks to, I think, a couple of things. I mean, one that we've talked about before is the fact that I believe we've talked about before is underwriting our worst adversary. And this shows you the wages, the costs of integration and accommodation over the years. And the fact that if you're really serious about combating China, how could you possibly give them access to your capital markets like we do, and particularly to fund companies that are working towards our demise? But then this administration is going to defend Taiwan, yet it isn't taking every single opportunity to ensure that not a single US dollar goes into funding the CCP's war machine. How could you possibly square that rhetoric with what the administration's Federal Retirement Thrift Investment Board, which consists of presidential appointees on it, is considering a plan like this that would allow the underwriting of, again, our demise? So I just put it out there to point out, once again, the fundamental unseriousness of the administration, and also the fact that decoupling is more than urgent. We need it here. It's actually an imperative as a nation.
So it takes me back to this same symposium that Inez and I were recently in. And I remember making some point about Taiwan in particular. Ben, you chaired this really interesting exchange at NatCon Orlando between Mike Anton and Mike Pillsbury about whether the U.S. should actually go to war if strictly necessary, if the People's Liberation Army actually starts marching into Taipei. I personally ultimately agree with Mike Anton on that one, that we should not. That does not mean that we should not be taking extremely kind of, urgent kind of policies and focus to prevent it at virtually all costs, short of war, that from actually happening. I do. But at the symposium that Inez and I were at recently, I was thinking of Taiwan. And, look, at the end of the day, I tend to be pretty realist when it comes to foreign policy. China is here to stay as a great power. That's not going anywhere, short of catastrophic humanity and the nuclear war and the defeat of this civilization. And that's not going anywhere. So I think that is here to stay. And we need to kind of effectively make peace with that. So from that perspective, in the grand scheme of things, kind of just looking at kind of the piece of the geopolitical chessboard, it is not truly obvious to me that Taiwan kind of being reabsorbed into Beijing's sphere of influence is the end of the world. However, the reason that it is, empirically speaking, what Joe Biden previously would have called a big effing deal, the reason that it is a massive deal, among other reasons, actually, is really because of Taiwan's semiconductor manufacturing company. It's really because of TSMC, which is one of the most prolific semiconductor manufacturers in the entire world. And they are disproportionately responsible for many of the kind of high-end chips. TSMC has surpassed Intel, America's own Intel, in kind of recent decades as being one of the most advanced and sophisticated chip makers. And we use those chips, obviously, in our products all the time. I mean, we use them in our vehicles and our fighter jets. So that is a really compelling argument, I think, for some sort of national security oriented industrial policy measures to reshore some of these critical supply chains, if nothing else. I agree with the thrust of your comments as well, Ben, that a broader kind of economic decoupling is necessary, but I think a good place to start, if we can't get bipartisan agreement on the national security implications of kind of semiconductors and chips, if nothing else, then I think we're probably heading towards a pretty bad place.
Yeah, I'll just agree on that last point. If we cannot get bipartisan agreement on that, because we have been so bought and sold by these special interests, and that's why I think the Hunter Biden case continues to be so important, not just because of Hunter Biden, but because of how it implicates so many other people, and in a totally bipartisan grift. This is just one instance that we see because he's the president's son. What we don't see is all of the other people that have been working for companies and now have close ties and know people in positions of power over there, and who will try to soften our policy at any given moment with the financial interests in the back of their mind and some nonsense justification in the front of their mind about how we need to be. We need not inflame another great power, and this has to be more calculated and blah 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 blah. All of these sort of platitudes that are, of course, true in isolated cases, but not in other ones, like, for instance, a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. That you're going to see so many people who have been compromised try to soften our policy at every given turn. We already see it, but as things escalate, you're going to see people who have been compromised try to soften our policy at every given turn, and they will be recycling the platitudes used by the Chinese Communist Party against us about how America needs to clean its own house and is racist and irredeemably bigoted in myriad different ways. This is a preview of what is to come as the tensions escalate. And if we cannot have bipartisan agreement on some very basic issues like national security, TikTok is another area where we see this, the national security implications of TikTok. Basically the PSYOP that they're running is just remarkable. So if we don't have that bipartisan agreement, I don't know that we ever will. And with that, I'll kick it over to you, Inez.
Yeah, I mean, just a couple brief points before we turn to closing remarks. First of all, just as a side point, Ben, when you were talking, I was thinking about the fact that, you see the agencies are trying to walk it back. I mean, there's a point here about who's making policy, and it's easy to slide it into, yes, that the president does seem like he is out to lunch half the time, if not more, and that's deeply concerning. But there's actually a broader point here that to me is even more concerning, right? The president has now said 3 times a particular policy on Taiwan, whether it's a dumb or not policy, right? Just leaving that aside for a moment. And then we have the entire apparatus of the government saying, no, that's not our policy, right? That's because, it raises not only the question of whether Joe Biden knows what he's saying or not, but since he's now said it 3 times, it raises the question of who is making or who makes US foreign policy. And is it the elected president or is it the unelected agencies that he allegedly heads? But in reality, we all know he really doesn't. And that's not unique to Joe Biden. That is a larger problem of unelected bureaucracy making critical decisions for the country, sometimes even over the heads of elected officials. And the second point is that, I think just to speak to what Emily was just saying, capitalism needs side constraints. Capitalism is an excellent economic system. It produces an enormous amount of wealth. In fact, it has, really brought so many, millions, billions of people out of $1-a-day poverty in the world. So it has an enormous engine of creating prosperity. That being said, that's what it does. It creates prosperity. It won't create, a good or great nation in itself. And sometimes there are national or common interests that need to subordinate the profit or the prosperity motive. GDP is not the only way to measure whether America is doing well or doing poorly. And national security is the most obvious, it seems to me, of those side constraints, right? If the pursuit of profit is taking American companies to China to sell the family jewels at the expense of American national security, that seems to me to be a reason to put some kind of restraint on that seeking profit motive, even though I'm generally in favor of the profit motive because I think it comports with human nature, but that doesn't mean that we don't limit it in ways where there is a very obvious, for example, and I think national security is kind of the easiest one. It becomes more complicated if you want to talk about what's our domestic common good, right? But national security is a really good place to start in terms of that kind of side constraint. But with that, I will kick it out. Does anybody have final comments before we want to wrap up?
So look, I guess going back to the topic that is dominating the news this week, and properly so, of course, which is the tragedy at Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas. So just a few kind of final thoughts on this truly tragic situation. So look, I am a gun owner. I'm a proud gun owner. I have been very outspoken on this issue. I have a concealed carry license. I even own a quote unquote assault weapon. And privately speaking, I referred to that weapon with friends as my Warsaw Ghetto weapon, as my truly, I don't know if I'm allowed to say this in the podcast, but that's like my shit hits the fan weapon. I mean, that is my weapon where if all else goes to hell, if society breaks loose, and the magazines and the rounds of ammunition, that's what I want. So for that reason alone, I don't necessarily take offense if someone calls me a gun nut or anything like that. But having said that, this simply has to stop. This spate of these horrific teens and these mass shootings has to stop. The problem, obviously, is that there is simply not a serious counterparty to these discussions. And I think that we should, again, in theory, be open to some sort. I mean, holding aside the involuntary commitment thing, which I feel quite strongly about, I think, Inez is totally right. That is something that we really should be pounding. But even kind of sticking within the confines of incremental gun measures, I don't necessarily have a zealous ideological animus to something like a quote unquote red flag law. I just am not empirically sold that it works. And the rebuttable presumption, to kind of use legalese and lawyer speak, simply has to be against these incremental reforms, obviously, because those who are seeking to kind of infringe on the rights of gun owners have to show by clear and convincing evidence this will clearly cut to the heart of the problem. And to date, I am simply not convinced that anything like that happens to be the case. So as the rhetoric is going to reach a fever pitch here over the next few weeks with the Buffalo tragedy and now the Texas tragedy, the onus, the impetus really is, I think, on conservatives to kind of do the whole William F. Buckley thing and stand athwart history yelling stop. Again, with the kind of the asterisk that I think we should be at least open to being persuaded by clear and convincing empirical evidence. But to my knowledge, that evidence simply does not exist on any of these proposed reforms.
I'll jump in after.
Go ahead and ask. Go ahead.
I'll jump in because my final thought is related to that, Josh. We hear it even on this podcast. We've talked about hardening schools as targets. There may be limited things that we can do, but let's not forget that this shooter, shot his way through armed police in order to commit the acts that he did. It does seem to me to all of the serious conversation to me, whether for practical reasons, because it's not just one of the main things to realize is it's not whatever the gun lobby. This is actually Americans are divided on the gun control question. It's one of the few things that few cultural issues that conservatives actually have managed to hold the line in the culture. And it is a real divide among the American people, not because some lobby spent X number of dollars. So to my mind, all of the actual serious conversation about how to stop or at least reduce these acts from happening has to happen outside of the gun conversation. And unfortunately, and I would add actually the whole like white nationalist conversation to that as well. We really do have to have a serious conversation about what kind of society we have if we are at the level of having to harden schools as targets. It's not, again, that I'm wholly opposed to all of those proposals. It's that, I think the left has a point here that we don't want to live in a society where that's necessary. And it's not some kind of pie in the sky, sort of utopian vision where that's not necessary. All we have to do is go back 30, 40, 50 years in this country, or look at some of the other countries. And I really think that the evidence is very much against guns being the determining a differential factor here. But we do have to look at what it is in American society that makes it so that these incidents are more common here than they are around the world, and that violence more generally in our society is more common than, for example, in corresponding European countries. There are some really tough questions that we're going to have to ask ourselves. But to my mind, all of that serious conversation is just not going to happen as long as we're spinning ourselves in the same predictable circles about guns and white nationalism, because those are not two factors that are really not going to add in any serious or substantive way to how we try to prevent this from happening as much as humanly possible.
So, and what I was going to say is we just in the hours after the shooting, I was party to a conversation about whether or not red flag laws have legitimacy. And I'm not going to get into the nitty gritty of the conversation or the policy itself, but someone raised the issue of red flag laws in this era of incredibly inflated definitions of what constitutes a white nationalist or what constitutes a terrorist. And so to me, without going into the granular details of a policy, I do think it's a very good and disturbing example of how we are kneecapped by our inability to perform basic functions as a society, like consensus definitions, like agreeing and getting to a consensus on basics, like what actually is racism, bigotry, terrorism, violence. If violence is pronoun misusage, then what is the future of a red flag law? And that might sound like a stupid, insane Alex Jones question, but it actually really isn't, because we saw the terrorist definition yielded against parents at school board meetings just over the course of the pandemic. And we know that the government is intentionally contributing to this definition inflation. And that is really, truly disturbing. It's not an argument for or against specific laws about background checks or red flags or whatever, but it is an argument that we are becoming incapable of even producing reasonable policy solutions because we have implicated and we have normalized and conditioned so much of the country to see so many other people in the country as dangers and bigots, and threats to their physical safety.
Yeah, I think the problem is of a piece of a broader one, which is that, and obviously we have our own view on this, but every single political cultural debate that we have is a bad faith one. If your working assumption is that the other side wants to destroy you and eviscerate your rights and subjugate you, then it's very tough to try to have a logical conversation about any of these issues. And if we even got to the question of what has led to such antisocial behavior in society. I shudder to think what the left's prescriptions would be to solve it, what they would suggest about what needs to happen in society to change the conditions that we don't end up with people, loners, people who have all sorts of problems, troubled problems in their homes and beyond, that leads them to take acts such as these. So I think we find ourselves in a perilous position, in part because it's of a piece with a broader one, which is of a society that is declining in terms of moral virtue, patriotism, the family, beyond God, of course. And then you add on to that the fact that we can't even litigate any of these issues in an even-handed and good faith fashion, because to Emily's point, the assumption may well be that if you have an opposing view, that is violence itself, and that requires a response by law enforcement to remedy that violence. I don't want to leave us in a terrible lurch there on this last point, but I think it's important context for this issue. I'll say briefly one sort of positive or optimistic point for the week, which will sort of preview likely what I'll cover next week, is that there have been some really fascinating revelations in this John Durham trial of Michael Sussman, the former Hillary Clinton campaign lawyer. There are two stories here. One are the various revelations that have come out during fascinating testimony put forth by members of the FBI, Democrat super lawyer Mark Elias, and others. And then another level of this, which is the media's silence on these revelations. We learned, for example, that the 7th floor of the FBI, the senior rank of the FBI, was pushing, for example, for the continued pursuit of the Trump organization Alpha Bank, Russian Alpha Bank hoax, that these servers, there was a secret back channel, servers communicating with each other. While the agents on the ground knew almost immediately it was BS, they got pressure from above to continue pursuing, and they weren't allowed to probe as to where the information was coming from. We also understand that Hillary Clinton herself gave the thumbs up for her mouthpieces to go out and spread the Russia Alpha Bank rumor. Jake Sullivan put out a press release about it. Now the National Security Advisor, Hillary Clinton herself, tweeted it out in October 31st. Hillary tweeted it right before the election. And then, of course, we've also found out that journalists themselves were confidential human sources, that is, informants for the government in connection with some of the allegations that were raised about Trump, Russia. So there are a whole slew of revelations. The fact they're not being covered, of course, speaks for itself, in part because the media is implicated in this, because they have egg in their face over it. And of course, they want it to go away. I'm still not at all sanguine about where the Durham special counsel goes in terms of actually bringing to justice the governmental officers who perpetrated this fraud, this massive scandal on the American people and corrupted our political process and undermined their institutions. But all that said, there have been some positive revelations thus far from John Durham's work. And so we can look at that as one minor positive in a sea of awful.
And with that, hopefully slightly optimistic final point, I believe that we are out of time. So on behalf of Ben, Emily, Josh, thanks for tuning in. I'm Inez Stepman, and we'll see you at the next NatCon Squad.